So, hey everyone, I'm Kaustubh.
And hi everyone, I'm Shreya, and we are the host for today's event.
Welcome to the live stream by GLUG and ITH in collaboration with IST, CSEC, and ROBOSOC. We are here again celebrating Open Source Month with another amazing event on Julia and open source.
Thank you all for joining us today. I would like to tell you that you can put in all your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer as many questions as possible. So, for those who are wondering what open source and Julia are, we will start with giving a very brief introduction.
So let me tell you about open source. Open source softwares are softwares, whose code is available publicly. Anyone can view and modify the code base. Some of the most popular open source softwares are VLC Media Player, Linux operating system, Firefox browser, VS Code, and there are many more examples out there.
And talking about Julia, Julia is an open source language released in early 2012 and is gaining popularity nowadays. It is known to have speed like C and dynamism of Python. What makes Julia unique is that it provides an extensive library of mathematical functions with a great numerical accuracy. So, guys, let us dive deeper into the concepts of Julia and open source with our guest for today.
As the open source season continues, we have Logan Kilpatrick as our special guest. He works as a community manager for the Julia language and is a member of the board of directors at NumFocus. Aside from all these, he's an avid contributor to open source. We are lucky to have him with us today.
Thank you, Logan. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. Happy Monday, Shreya. That was a wonderful explanation of Julia and a great intro. So I appreciate it.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. So, as everybody's pretty excited about the session, so without any further ado, let's start. Over to you, Logan. All the best.
Thank you. Wonderful. Cool. So I think just to sort of perhaps situate ourselves and get a little bit of a better idea of the folks in the audience. If perhaps I see a lot of fire symbols coming in into the chat, but if you've perhaps used Julia before, I think it would be interesting to know. So if you want to put whether or not you've perhaps used Julia in the chat, and I'll wait a sec for folks to put in, just so again I can get a better sense of the audience and who folks are who are listening to this. I'm not seeing the chat being flooded by any responses, so I'll push forward. But again, hopefully, I can sort of set the stage for whether or not folks are regardless of whether folks are familiar with Julia or not. I think this will give sort of a nice motivation and build off of some of the context that has already been set for what Julia is, why you would want to use it, sort of how you might actually be able to contribute to the ecosystem as a whole. So let's dive in and talk about all of those things. So anytime I'm talking about Julia, I think this is the question coming through into the chat. Why Julia is the question that I hope to answer in the next couple of minutes. And I think, sort of taking a step back and sort of not even just talking about why Julia, but just in general, why do we need another programming language? And I think that's a fundamentally a good question to ask. We have languages like Python, we have MATLAB, we have R, we have C++ and C, we have 20 other languages that are out there. Why was Julia created? Why do we need another language? And fundamentally, the problem that Julia solves is the two-language problem. And if folks aren't familiar with the two-language problem, you're lucky that you haven't encountered it so far. But the reality is that Julia is the reality is that for languages like Python, for example, you have that really high-level dynamic syntax that enables you to write code that's elegant and write code that is actually easy to understand in a lot of senses. But when you actually want to take that code and use it in a production environment, Julia is My page says, oops, something went wrong. Try reloading the page. I don't know if that means that I'm still live or not.
You are live, Logan.
Awesome. Cool. Sorry, I thought it just totally stopped working. So again, when you have a language like Python that's high level and dynamic, the trade-off that's made with that language specifically is that you don't have a lot of speed, which is one of the really big challenges. So you sort of say, okay, well, how can I find a language that has speed? I'll go use C++ or C or something like that. And again, the challenge with a language like C++ or C is that it's not high level and it's sort of not easy to use, and you have to deal with pointers and all the other challenges. So I think that's sort of the fundamental trade-off that's been made in a lot of cases, and folks continue to make this trade-off, actually. If you look at a lot of the really popular machine learning frameworks, they're still making this trade-off. All the popular machine learning frameworks have a Python API that you can use to interact with them. But if you actually look under the hood and you look at, for example, PyTorch or TensorFlow, those are actually C++ machine learning libraries. There's just a high-level wrapper written on top of them, which is in Python, which makes the sort of interface in the API more accessible to general programmers. So those two examples are sort of the prime candidates for the two language problem. And again, they wouldn't have to do that if they had written their code in Julia, which is awesome. So that's really where Julia comes in and solves this. It has the high level dynamic syntax. It has the speed of a language like C or C++, which is awesome. So diving a little bit more to some of the reasons why Julia, hopefully answering that question for folks. We talked about the speed. The other aspect of that is the reproducibility that comes with Julia. I think there's a lot of pieces that are sort of baked into the ecosystem and the language that make your code reproducible. And again, why this is so important, the way that I think about it is, if you have code that isn't reproducible, if you have an environment that isn't reproducible, it's basically worthless. I think, I'm always interested to see, people's academic papers, and I read a lot of academic papers about machine learning and things like that. But oftentimes, the results that they give aren't directly reproducible. And to me personally, if something isn't directly reproducible, it's basically null and void. There's really not a lot of value to something unless I can personally rerun it on my computer and produce the same results. And Julia, again, has a lot of these features that are baked into the language and the ecosystem as a whole, which means that you can write your code, run it, and then send that off to somebody else, and they're able to really quickly, without having to do a bunch of additional setup stuff, set up and activate that environment, and then run the code as it is, and it should just work. Which is awesome, I think. The other piece, as far as why Julia is it goes hand in hand, but the community and the interoperability. I'll start with the community. I think, obviously I'm biased because I spent a lot of time thinking about the Julia community and working on things in that sense. But I really do think that the Julia community is such a special place. Lots of people willing to help sort of push you forward and help you learn the language and help you sort of overcome a lot of the challenges that you might run into as you're adopting a new language. And again, I've had that experience firsthand of people willing to go out of their way and help sort of me in my package development experience or sort of more generally with whatever the challenge that I'm having is. So I think it's such a fun and engaging community to be a part of. And if folks haven't sort of dabbled, it's one of the reasons that I stick around. I think the people are great, and it makes a lot of fun. The last piece of this, and again, there's a lot of reasons why Julia, and this is just 3 of them that I'm highlighting. The last piece of this is the interoperability, and it's such a fun word to say, and it always sounds weird in my head when I say it. But what interoperability means is that you can take a language like Julia, and you can take an actual Julia file itself and actually put in code from other languages inside of that file. So you could take something like Python code and using pycall.jl actually embed Python code inside of a Julia file and just leverage it to its full extent. You don't have to do anything special to make this happen. You can just use pycall and it just works. And again, if you think about, okay, well, what does this enable for me as a developer using Julia? It enables you to, hey, I already have some code that I've written in Python. I want to use that code in Julia now, but then perhaps do some additional stuff in actual Julia itself. You can do that. You can just run the Python code that you've written, have the results come out, and then take those results, ingest them, and use them in an actual Julia script. So you can think about, perhaps in a machine learning workflow, you might want to perhaps leverage PyTorch or TensorFlow, and hey, those have really great APIs, and you know how to use them, but perhaps there's like a lot of data pre-processing that needs to happen, and it's really data intensive, and it takes a really long time. Maybe you want to use Julia for that, and then sort of just hand off the data to TensorFlow or PyTorch, and have it sort of just do its thing. So this is totally possible. This works sort of out of the box. I just wrote an article recently about how to integrate write your machine learning models and integrate Julia with Python and the Hugging Face hub. And if folks aren't familiar with Hugging Face, it's sort of like GitHub for machine learning models. If you're interested in machine learning, I just wrote that article, so you can find it on my Twitter, or LinkedIn, or something like that. So again, this interoperability is super important, and it also, again, from a language adoption standpoint, the other piece of why this is important is, I'm essentially here trying to convince folks that that switching to Julia or using Julia or giving the ecosystem a shot is worthwhile. And you can imagine how much more difficult of a sell this would be for me personally, and for everyone else in the Julia community, if folks couldn't leverage the existing code they have. So it's sort of in my opinion, for languages coming out in the next 5 to 10 years, this interoperability is sort of a must-have. If your language doesn't integrate with all the other code that's ever been written, it's really difficult for you to convince other people. You sort of have the starting point is a big challenge for that. So again, for interoperability, you can also integrate with Java. You can integrate with R, C, C++. So lots of options there. Again, we talked about, some of these high-level features. I'll just mention, since I haven't explicitly said it yet, Julia is an open source project. It's an open source language. It's dynamic and composable, and again, really well suited for problems that are on this slide. I have data intensive problems, but I actually think the more general way of saying this is for hard problems. Oftentimes, people who are using Julia, and Albert actually put this question in the chat: how much time can we expect the industry will take to start functioning with Julia? So, Julia is already being used in industry, and the folks who are using Julia in industry and academia are using it for some of the most challenging problems that you can imagine. And we'll actually talk about some of those next up. But that's really where the best use cases for Julia is in those cases where, hey, I'm trying to solve this really difficult problem, and sort of maybe Python and MATLAB, aren't performant enough to sort of do the job. That's where Julia a lot of times can come in and help solve that problem a little bit better. So talking about these use cases and what some of them are, this is, again, one of the most interesting ones, just because climate change is such a pressing issue at the present moment, and will be for a long time. The Klima project out of Caltech is basically they're leveraging Julia to help build climate models that will sort of be a foundational piece in our understanding of climate change. And again, if folks are familiar with climate models at all, or maybe perhaps not, climate models are really they're really intense simulations to run. You can sort of imagine why that's the case, just because there's so many variables and there's so many things happening in the scope of the environment and the planet, that building these climate models is really difficult. And the folks at Klima decided to use Julia in order to build this platform so that they can model the entire planet, basically, and build climate models at that scale, which is really awesome. So that's definitely an interesting project, and lots of interesting climate simulation pieces that are going on in that space. The other one that I think is worth talking about is the Pumas project, and there's a bunch of different facets of this company, of this project. But basically, Pumas is working on accelerating pharmaceutical development using Julia, which again is such a fascinating use case, and it's entirely applicable. In the COVID pandemic age that we're all living through. Puma's the software that they've built is the pharmaceutical software that they built actually helps accelerate the discovery of potential drugs, which is super interesting. And again, you can think about how that's a particularly impactful piece right now, because what the difference between a week and a month as far as some of these drugs go is it has a massive difference in the outcome for a lot of people around the world. So hopefully this, Pumas is working with Pfizer and Moderna and some of the other companies. So hopefully this continues to be an area where folks, think in their mind, okay, I want to do pharmaceutical modeling. What's the best way to do that? It's using Julia. And I think that's the sort of trend that I'm seeing in this direction. So hopefully the sort of takeaway from all this maybe has been for folks that Julia is worth a try. So again, hopefully I've conveyed that there's some interesting use cases. It's syntactically similar to Python. It's at the speed at the order of C and C++. So you're really getting the best of both worlds, and can really use Julia to solve some of the most interesting problems. So thinking about, what would the next step be for somebody who hears this and is like, okay, Julia is perhaps worth trying. What can I actually do about this? I think the next step might be to consider learning Julia. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can go about this. I think folks tend to like MIT, which is why I always highlight this course. But the folks at MIT actually taught a really great course using Julia, and it's you can go to the website computationalthinking.mit.edu. It's a free and open course taught by Alan Edelman, who's one of the co-creators of the Julia programming language, and David Sanders, and who's a massive contributor to the entire ecosystem. So lots of really great folks involved in this course. Bunch of incredible videos and assignments, and also the course website itself is pretty cutting edge, state of the art. So lots of cool things. Would definitely recommend if folks are sort of interested in the traditional classroom learning environment. This is perhaps one of the ways that you could go about learning Julia. There's also a few other platforms that I'll suggest, and you can go to julialang.org. To learn a little bit more. But Exorcism, which is the icon on the left-hand side, is a platform where you can go and learn and actually get tutoring for free from mentors through this platform. So Julia is one of the languages on this website, and you can learn more at julialang.org. We also have a ton of YouTube content, and then associated with that YouTube content, we have Julia Academy, which is where you can go and learn courses for free from a bunch of experts across a bunch of domains. So really interesting stuff, and definitely I would suggest all of these places are good ways to get started and to learn a little bit more. Shivam is asking, what is the next step for Julia, and how can we contribute to it? So I think this is a great question, and we'll sort of go into that perfectly. Thank you for the wonderful transition into the next slide. So I will posit that what the next step for Julia is as a language, I think, might be slightly different depending on who you ask. I think, to me, what's next for Julia is sort of just this continued growth phase. I think right now we're growing, the ecosystem and the community are growing so rapidly there's actually a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that the sort of rough edges in the community are sort of, rounded out a little bit. So that's where I spend a lot of my time right now is sort of just trying to identify, hey, where are folks getting tripped up? Where are the opportunities where, some of these more mature languages or ecosystems are doing, these things really, really well, and we're sort of missing the mark on those areas, and then trying to push forward and make sure that we're not losing people in sort of the onboarding or the learning process as they get involved in the community. So that's what I think sort of the next step for the language and the community are. But as far as how we can contribute, this is again a great question, and we'll dive into that. So I think there's a bunch of different fundamental ways of contributing in open source in general. And again, this a lot of what I'll say in the next few slides doesn't necessarily only apply to Julia. Again, we're sort of looking at it through that context right now, but you sort of have your traditional code contributions, and then you have sort of the next potential option, which is the documentation contribution, which is a huge and important one. And then we have sort of the third, more so neglected option, which is non-technical contributions. And I'd consider, me giving this talk right now to fall into that category of non-technical contributions. I know we're sort of talking about technical concepts and things like that, but I'm not writing code, I'm not writing documentation, there's no pull request, I'm not, this doesn't show up in my GitHub activity. So really it falls under that non-technical contribution, or non-code contribution, which again, I think is such a important area. And also, truthfully, I think that the dirty secret about open source is that these non-code, non-technical contributions can actually be some of the most impactful contributions that an ecosystem can have made. And it's also oftentimes the things that nobody else is doing, which is why to me, it's such an interesting opportunity, because you have all these opportunities, areas where it doesn't take a lot of technical work or just a lot of work in general, but it's not sort of in line with what other people want to do or are interested in doing. So it's really easy to sort of slip in, do that work, and sort of see the result of that pretty quickly. So let's talk about a few of these options here. And again, like we talked about, I'm going to turn this into a t-shirt. I think this is one of my favorite quotes. There's more to open source than code. And I think it's such a true statement. And folks who think that they sort of need to get started in open source by making a pull request, I think this is one of the biggest fallacies that exists in the open source space. So again, when I think about contributing, I think of this arc that you see here. And you can see on the right-hand side, which is sort of the end of the arc, that's where the code contribution is. But really, there's all of these steps that happen before you get to the code contribution. And like anything, this is a choose your own adventure. So perhaps you're at the point where you're like, you know what, I know, perhaps I know a little bit about Julia, or perhaps I'm just generally more interested in diving in and making a technical contribution. That's totally cool. You want to jump right to the code contribution? Let's do it. That works for me. But what I think is that there's a lot of people who aren't ready for that. And again, they're sort of told over and over again, just go look at help wanted issues or good first issues on GitHub, and that will be your place to start. And really, that oftentimes those help wanted and those good first issues aren't actually well written to the point that someone who's completely new to the project could just go and look at them and dive in and start tackling things. That's oftentimes not the case. So there's a lot of steps you can take before you get to that point. One of the things is sort of in general, just talking about and digesting information about open source, going to this talk, listening to other people's talks, talking to your friends about open source, perhaps starting to use the project a little bit, opening issues if things don't make sense or things aren't working, perhaps writing a few blog posts about open source, making a documentation contribution. All of those things are great ways to lead up to that final code contribution, which is so important. But also, again, I think all those steps before you get to the code contribution are equally as important. So a question in the chat, how how useful is Julia for AI and ML as compared with Python? Again, I think this is such a great question. I think, the reality is that Julia is, in comparison to Python, a relatively small language and community. There's a lot of good stuff in the Python ecosystem with respect to AI and ML. I can say I use Python almost predominantly for a lot of my machine learning and AI workflows outside of all the Julia stuff that I do. So again, it's definitely the sort of industry standard at the moment. I think where Julia really starts to come in and shine is again in a lot of these really difficult problems. PyTorch and TensorFlow are great tools, but you're sort of, there's a few things that you're sort of beholden to when you use those languages. One is, or use those frameworks rather. One of those challenges with using some of the really large Python machine learning frameworks is, if you want to dive sort of one level deeper than the API, if you want to look at the source code for PyTorch or TensorFlow to really understand, okay, how does this framework work? How does, backpropagation work? When you look at the source code, you can go on GitHub right now and see this. Again, we talked about this. They're suffering from the two language problem. They have 60% of their code base in C++. So now you do not only need to understand all the Python stuff that they're doing, but you also need to go and brush up on your C++ and make sure you understand that aspect of it. And to me, that's such a fundamental barrier. Like I obviously I learned C++ during school, but I haven't written C++ in probably 4 or 5 years, and it's a really difficult proposition for me to go and learn another language just so that I can sort of understand how the machine learning frameworks actually work. And you don't have that problem in Julia. If you look up fluxml.ai or flux.jl, which is Julia's deep learning / machine learning package, and go look at it on GitHub, it's 100% Julia code. The actual framework is written in Julia entirely. And again, what this enables for you as a user of this is, hey, you want to take a little quick peek under the hood and see how something actually works, and perhaps maybe go and implement your own version of it, or a faster version, or a different version for your use case. You can actually go and do that. I mean, it's written in Julia. If you're writing your normal code in Julia, looking at the source code version is really not a big step between your code and their code, which I love. I think that's such an important piece. And again, the challenge for Julia in the AI and ML space is that there's just so much content, there's so many people, there's so many users of all those Python machine learning packages, that I actually think a lot of the growth for Julia will come in the other scientific domains. I think sort of outside of where Python is dominating things, I think in the chemistry space, in the physics space, in these other scientific domains, that's really where a lot of the growth for Julia will happen. And then eventually, I think the machine learning and AI piece will catch up, but it's like fighting, the most uphill battle that you could imagine, trying to compete with Python in the ML and data science space. It's a really difficult proposition. So yeah, I think hopefully that answers your question. How is Julia for competitive programming? I think that's another great question. I think there's definitely folks who are using Julia for competitive programming. I think perhaps one of the difficult pieces right now might be that whether or not Julia is supported on whatever website you're using for competitive programming. I'll make the disclaimer that I've never done any competitive programming myself. It's just not what personally interests me. But I've definitely seen threads and folks talking about competitive programming, and how they're leveraging Julia for that. So again, it's something to try out, and perhaps if there's not a super robust ecosystem built around the competitive programming space in Julia, you can be that person who sort of pushes that forward. And that's what I love about the Julia space right now, is that there's so many opportunities for an individual to come in, or a few individuals to come in and push forward on something they're passionate about, and actually have a real impact, have a tangible impact, which is super exciting. Another question, how's Julia on the cloud CNCF/serverless situation? I think another great question. I don't spend a lot of time looking at the CNCF stuff. I know that Julia has super robust cloud support. You can do most of the things you can with with other languages, and I think it really just depends on what you want to do. I'm sure that there's still sort of sharp edges in a lot of those spaces, but I do think that Julia is entirely compatible with whatever you're trying to do in the cloud. I think some of the most robust cloud deployments and distributed workflows are happening on Julia. So it's entirely possible for you to do that and leverage a lot of those cloud technologies. That's a great question. So jumping back into contributing, we talked about the arc of contributing. Again, what's a potential way to get started? So we're still technically within Hacktoberfest, so I was trying to give folks a little bit of hopefully some motivation to go and contribute to Julia. The question that was coming in about machine learning and AI, if you're interested in sort of taking a stab at this during Hacktoberfest, we've had a bunch of great contributors come in and write a bunch of really useful and helpful machine learning tutorials in the Flux ecosystem that I've been helping review. So if that's something that's interesting to you, definitely give it a shot. If you go to julialang.org/Hacktoberfest, you can find the relevant repositories to make these contributions. But I think, again, lots of really interesting stuff happening in the ML AI space, and a ton of different ways that you can contribute to the ecosystem as a whole. So I just wanted to end with a few of these quotes, and these are from a recruiter talking about in a Forbes article that I was reading, talking about what companies are looking for when they're hiring students. And I think, again, as I'm deeply passionate about open source, but I'm also a realist in the sense that at the end of the day, everybody needs to get a job to have an income and do that sort of stuff. So I sort of am thinking about that continuously as I'm talking about why somebody should be using Julia, why it's a worthwhile tool to get started with. And I think, all three of the pieces that are mentioned on this slide are highly relevant to Julia, and also directly correlated with you getting an interesting job after you finish school. So the first one, self-motivated and excited about technology. I've had in my own interview experiences the opportunity to talk, and perhaps folks have had this as well, talk about projects that you've worked on. And every time I get the opportunity to talk about a Julia project that I'm involved in, it's exciting for me. And what this means is that that sort of thing really shines through an interview. If you're talking to someone about something and that person is excited about it and deeply passionate about it, that shines through directly in an interview. So I think interviewers can see that, and I think having something, a project, whatever it is that you're actually interested in and you enjoyed working on, and getting to talk about that is such an important thing to have during the interview process. The other piece, again, when companies are hiring students fresh out of school, they're not hiring you because you're the most advanced programmer in the world, you're the best programmer in the world, you have the most experience. None of those things are true. The reason that companies are hiring you is because you have a fresh perspective. You have experience with the cutting edge tools that are being taught at university, et cetera, et cetera. And I think knowing Julia is one of these possible ways that you can show companies in an interview, hey, I have this fresh perspective. Everybody knows Python, everybody knows R, C++, all those languages, but I actually know something different. And here's why this is actually a better tool, perhaps, for what we want to be doing. So I think that fresh perspective piece is so important and so critical in the context of applying for jobs and actually doing the interviews. So definitely something to keep in mind in the space of Julia. And then this again applies really more to open source in general, but real world experience and outside the classroom learning. Having open source contributions is your online resume to share with companies and other people to say, hey, I actually did this stuff. And you can go online and you can see these contributions that I've made. I think, again, that's one of the challenges of working at a company is whenever you want to tell other people about what you did, you sort of have to, talk really generally and do all this stuff. But open source, you can literally point them to a pull request and say, go look at my code, review it. That's what I'm capable of doing, which I think is so awesome in the open source space. Question coming in: how come Julia is as fast as C, C++, but still as friendly as Python? Ooh, that's a good question, Spaceship. So I think what really enables this is an intentional design. Julia was built with the thought in mind that, the two language problem need not exist. So that was really the principal design decision that was made, was that we want to solve both of these problems. When Python was created, the thought wasn't, hey, let's build a really fast programming language, and then also, hey, let's make it high level and dynamic and usable by people. That's not the case. When Python was created, it was, hey, let's build something that's really easy to use. And it's been a tremendous success. Python is easy to use, but it's not performant and it's not fast. Because it wasn't designed to be. You can sort of do things after the hood, like, after the fact, and use like Python or something like that. But again, that's not fundamentally what the language was designed for. So it's really the intentional design. Also, I don't know if we talked about it or not, but Julia is just in time compiled or just ahead of time compiled. So it is technically a compiled language, but you really still get that speed right out of the gate, which is super nice. Question coming in: working on your own projects or doing open source contributions, which is better? Akshay, it really depends what gets you excited. I think at the end of the day, if you're like doing open source contributions isn't fun and exciting, there's no reason to do it. You're forcing yourself to do something that doesn't keep you engaged from a long-term standpoint is not the right choice. I think, again, do what gets you excited. For me, I almost am uninterested in doing things that don't have sort of that wider impact. So when I'm thinking about, okay, how am I spending my time? Could it be this little personal project, or could I actually go and contribute to some ecosystem that thousands and thousands of people are going to use, and I can help write this tutorial or fix this bug or add this feature that all of the people in that ecosystem will be able to leverage. To me, I'm always like, where can I have the most impact? Therefore, it's going and contributing to open source, not on my own personal project. Do companies prefer one over the other? I think that probably depends on the company. I think my experience has been that it really, in my opinion, it shows more if you can contribute to open source than if you can build personal projects. And the reason for that is you can sort of start to think about, in the scope of a personal project, there's not really many constraints that are put in place. You can sort of do whatever you want. If you want to, enforce all these weird paradigms and not use pull requests and not open issues, no one is stopping you from doing those things. In the context of open source, you're really contributing to actual software. So you're going to have to write tests. You're going to have to go through the pull request review process. And those are all the things that a company wants to have happen at their own organization. They want you to write pull requests. They want you to write unit tests. So to me, it makes the most sense to contribute to those open source projects if I was looking at it from a company perspective. Question coming in: will Julia be as successful as Python? If all my hard work and everyone else's hard work in the Julia community pays off, hopefully it will be as successful as Python. We'll have to keep our fingers crossed. Let's see. I use Redis, Elasticsearch a lot in my stack. How well are connector packages developed in Julia so I can switch over to Julia when I start a new project? That's an interesting question. I'm not familiar with Redis nor Elasticsearch, to be honest with you. So I think I'd have to do a little bit of digging as far as the connector packages. It's a really good question, though. I wish I had a good answer. I'll have to look it up. If you can provide some, like, a little bit more context as far as what Redis and Elasticsearch do, maybe I can think of an analog, or just try Googling like Elasticsearch in Julia or Redis in Julia and see if there's any articles that pop up. It took 15 years from 1991 for Python to become that popular, and Julia is only discovered 5 years back. Yeah, it's definitely true. I think I think it's a slightly different situation than Python. I think in 1991, the number of people who were programming as a percentage or what have you was way smaller than it is today. I think today you have this robust, this vibrant, this growing programming ecosystem. So it's a lot easier to scale up a language and a community really quickly. And I think a really prime example of this is PyTorch as a framework. PyTorch was created in 2018, which is ridiculous. Or I think the Python version of PyTorch was created in 2018. It had the Lua roots which is funny to think about. If folks don't know Lua, it's another programming language. But yeah, I think within 3 years, PyTorch is one of the most popular machine learning frameworks that exists today. And I think Julia can have that same impact from a programming language standpoint, just like Python, just like R, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you, Logan, for the presentation. It was very enlightening. I hope everybody understood quite well, and more enthusiasts will join Julia and open source community. If anybody has a question, okay, no. So Logan, I have also some of my doubts regarding open source.
Yeah.
I have also some of my doubts. As the open source season is about to start, so can you tell me, like, what can I expect from a good proposal for open source?
Yeah, a good proposal for open source. It's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I have the full context to answer that. Do you mind clarifying, Sarita, what sort of proposal you're talking about? Are we talking about like a pull request, or sort of just like a general framework for contributing to open source?
Like, we can talk about GSOC is coming. So if a student if a student wants to contribute that proposal.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for folks interested in GSOC, the sort of worst kept secret about GSOC is that students who are successful in GSOC, students who get accepted in GSOC, do not wait until the application period to start getting involved in the project. If you want to get a GSOC slot, go and get involved in the project today. Go and find the projects from last year's GSOC. Look at who the mentors are. Go and ping the mentor, start making a contribution. It could be once a month. You could make a contribution once a month from now until the GSOC period, and your chances of being selected go up astronomically. And I think there's other students who can vouch for that. But I think that's the best way of doing it. If you're not getting involved with the project beforehand, it's a really difficult proposition to get accepted your first time around.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay,
Well,
so
yeah, starting, I just have a follow-up question for you, Logan, with this. So, like, a lot of people want to contribute to open source, but they are confused with the organization, like to which organization should they contribute to. So, what advice would you give for selecting an organization?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think, I'm obviously biased. I think doing Julia stuff is interesting and awesome. So there's always that option. But I think fundamentally, figuring out what it is that's interesting to you. I think open source in general is just code online. So it doesn't really narrow down at all sort of what you might be specifically interested in. But again, I think if there's areas that you're like, well, this gets me excited, like if it's, climate change because you don't want to die when you get older and you want to help solve that problem, I think that's great. If it's, artificial intelligence and machine learning because it's a super interesting domain right now and there's lots of opportunities. I think, figuring out what the domain that you're interested in and then figuring out the open source packages or ecosystems that are built around that domain. That's the framework that I use when I think about what I should be contributing to. So I'd suggest for folks to do the same thing. Find stuff that you're interested in and then go and find those open source projects that are sort of built around that ecosystem.
All right, that was really a good explanation for this.
Oh, okay. So, if I talk about Julia, can you tell me, for such a relatively young language, I'm talking about Julia, what are the difficulties you face when it comes to convincing people that use Julia instead of Python for their projects?
That's an excellent question. I think the most difficult proposition is, and we actually have seen this in a lot of the surveys that we've run, but it's actually people being constrained by things like their work environment. Like for me personally, like if I want to use Julia at work, outside of all the Julia stuff that I do, it's actually difficult to do that because there's, I need other people to be able to read my code and contribute to it. I need, all these other things to happen. And therefore I'm sort of constrained to use a tool like Python just because that's what everybody else knows how to use. So I think other people run into this problem as well. The other piece of it too is that, the reality is oftentimes the best tool for a job is the tool that you already know how to use. So if you have to, you're thinking about like a project for your class, is a normal person going to, write their, do their assignment using Python because they already know how to do it? Or is a normal person going to go learn a new programming language, all the intricacies of the ecosystem, and then go and build the project? I think most people would just do the project in Python because they already know it. So that's another one of the challenges is even though Julia might be better suited and a better tool for the job, folks don't want to use it because they already know this other thing. They really need that motivating factor. And I think for me, the motivating factor is all of these different opportunities to contribute and do something meaningful. That's what gets me excited. But for other people, like in actual industry settings, the motivation a lot of times is they've sort of hit the computational limit of what's possible with a language like Python. So they need Julia as a tool or they can't do their job anymore. So that's another one of the potential factors.
Yeah.
All right, Logan, that was like really an enlightening answer. So I hope everyone got it. So guys, due to time constraint, we will not be able to take up any more questions. I hope you guys definitely explore and try to give valuable contribution to open source in Julia. And it's been a pleasure being with you all today. Thank you everyone, and thank you Logan for joining us today and
Thank
for
you,
your
Logan.
valuable time.
Yeah, this was great. I appreciate everyone's questions. That was the best part. And again, if folks are interested in contributing and you have questions, feel free to shoot me a message on Twitter or the like, and I'll do my best to point you in the right direction.
Just one more question, Logan. If student wants to contribute to the Julia language only, so is there any way they can contribute to the Julia language, like any channel or community?
If you head to julialang.org/contribute, that's probably the best place to get started.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
And there's a community tab on the website too with all the links, Slack, Zulip, Discord, whatever you want.
We will definitely check that out. So this was really an inspiring and interesting session today. Thank you for joining us.
So, thank you, Logan. Thank you everyone for joining with us.
Take care.
Good.